When we talk about the early phase of this conflict, those first days in February 2026, it's tempting to look for a single trigger, a decisive moment where everything changed. But that's not how modern conflicts begin. They begin in ambiguity, they begin in interpretation, and above all, they begin in miscalculation. At that point, tensions between the United States, Israel, and Iran were already high. The strategic environment had been deteriorating for months, even years. As we discussed on Swedish or but what's critical in February is not just that tensions existed, it's how those tensions were understood by each side, because in geopolitics, perception is often more important than reality. Each actor operates with incomplete information shaped by intelligence reports, historical memory, and internal political pressures. And when you combine incomplete information with high stakes, you create the perfect conditions for misinterpretation. From the perspective of the United States and Israel, early intelligence in February suggested that Iran was accelerating certain military and nuclear-related activities. Now, whether that acceleration was intended as offensive preparation or defensive signaling is almost secondary. What matters is how it was perceived, and it was perceived as a narrowing of options, a signal that Iran was moving closer to a threshold that both Washington and Tel Aviv had long sought to prevent. So the logic begins to shift. Not yet into open conflict, but into a more proactive posture. Surveillance increases, readiness increases, contingency planning intensifies, and all of this happens quietly without public acknowledgement. Because in the early stages of escalation, signaling restraint is just as important as signaling strength. But here's the key. Iran is watching this unfold as well. And from its perspective, the same set of events looks very different. What the United States and Israel interpret as necessary precautions, Iran may interpret as preparation for aggression. And that's where the feedback loop begins. Iran responds in ways it believes are defensive, perhaps by dispersing assets, reinforcing strategic positions, or demonstrating capability through missile tests or regional signaling. But to its adversaries, those same actions look like escalation. And once that perception takes hold, every subsequent move is filtered through it. This is what we call a security dilemma. But in practice, it's much more human than theoretical. It's about fear, it's about uncertainty, and it's about the inability to fully trust the intentions of another actor whose interests fundamentally diverge from your own. So, by mid-February, you begin to see small but significant shifts, limited strikes, targeted operations, probing responses. These are not yet full-scale attacks, but they are not routine either. They are signals, carefully calibrated attempts to test boundaries, to measure response time, to understand where red lines truly lie. And yet, here's the paradox. Every test of the other side's resolve increases the risk of miscalculation, because in testing boundaries, you are also pushing them. At the same time, domestic pressures are intensifying within all three countries. In the United States, policymakers are under pressure to demonstrate strength and prevent further escalation. In Israel, the leadership is operating under an acute sense of vulnerability, where hesitation can be framed as weakness. And in Iran, the leadership is balancing internal stability with external pressure, seeking to project strength without overcommitting to a path that could spiral out of control. So you have three actors, all of whom believe they are acting defensively, all of whom are responding to perceived threats, and all of whom are watching the others with increasing suspicion. This is where strategic miscalculation becomes almost inevitable. Not because leaders are irrational, but because they are rational within their own frameworks. Each side is making decisions based on the best available information, but that information is incomplete, filtered, and often biased by history. And that's the deeper issue. There is no neutral observer in this system. Every signal is interpreted, every action is contextualized, and every response becomes part of a larger narrative. So when something happens, a strike, a counter-strike, a mobilization, it doesn't exist in isolation. It becomes evidence in a broader argument about intent. By the end of February, the situation has already shifted from tension to instability, not yet full-scale war, but no longer manageable through routine diplomacy or back-channel communication. The environment itself has changed, the tempo has increased, the margin for error has shrunk, and once that happens, the system becomes self-reinforcing. Each side feels compelled to act faster, to respond more decisively, to avoid being caught off guard, but in acting faster, they also reduce the time available for reflection, for verification, for restraint. That is the quiet danger of the early phase of conflict. It doesn't look like war. It looks like precaution. It looks like preparation. It looks like control. But underneath that surface, something else is happening. The system is shifting from stability to instability, from deterrence to doubt, from confidence to anxiety. And once that shift begins, it's very difficult to reverse. Because in international politics, as in life, it's not always the loud moments that define the outcome. Sometimes it's the quiet decisions made under uncertainty, the assumptions we make about others, and the risks we're willing to take based on those assumptions that determine the trajectory of everything that follows. If there's one lesson from this early phase, it's this: wars are rarely caused by a single mistake. They are caused by a series of small misjudgments, each one logical on its own, but collectively catastrophic in their outcome. And by the time you recognize the pattern, it may already be too late to stop it. If the early phase of this conflict was defined by miscalculation and misinterpretation, then the moment we move into March and early April 2026 is where the system crosses a very important threshold where ambiguity gives way to action. And once that happens, everything changes. This is the point where the conflict between the United States, Israel, and Iran stops being a question of signals and starts becoming a question of consequences. The transition from indirect pressure to direct strikes is not just a tactical shift, it's a psychological one, because once you move into open confrontation, you are no longer managing risk, you are absorbing it. Now, the decision to carry out coordinated strikes doesn't happen in a vacuum. It's the result of weeks, sometimes months, of internal debate, intelligence assessments, and strategic calculation. Leaders are asking themselves a very difficult question. Is this the last moment we can act before the cost becomes too high? Or is this already too late? And when that question arises, time becomes the central variable, not ideology, not rhetoric, time. Because in nuclear and near nuclear conflicts, time is everything. Now, the longer you wait, the more capable your adversary becomes. The earlier you act, the more uncertainty you introduce into the system. So from the perspective of Washington and Tel Aviv, the situation begins to look like a narrowing corridor. Iran is perceived to be advancing its capabilities, and diplomatic options are seen as increasingly ineffective. Negotiations are either stalled or no longer trusted. And in that environment, action begins to feel less like escalation and more like containment. The strikes themselves, targeting military infrastructure and facilities associated with Iran's strategic capabilities, are not framed as the beginning of war. They are framed as a preventive measure, a response to what is perceived as an imminent threat, a way to reset the balance before it tips too far. But here's where the psychological dimension becomes critical, because once strikes are launched, they fundamentally alter how each side interprets the other. The threshold has been crossed, and crossing that threshold has consequences that extend far beyond the immediate targets. For Iran, these strikes confirm a long-standing belief that external powers are not interested in coexistence, but in containment, or worse, coercion. From this perspective, the response cannot be limited. It must be meaningful enough to restore deterrence, because if the response is too weak, it signals vulnerability. And in a system defined by power, vulnerability invites further pressure. So Iran responds, not necessarily with full force, but with enough force to signal capability and resolve. Missile launches, drone operations, and targeted responses are not just acts of retaliation. They are messages. They are meant to communicate that Iran retains agency, that it is not a passive actor in the system. And this is where the dynamic becomes self-reinforcing, because every action triggers a reaction. Every reaction raises the stakes, and every increase in stakes reduces the space for restraint. What's particularly dangerous in this phase is that both sides still believe they are in control. They believe escalation is being managed, that each step is calibrated, that there is still room to step back if necessary. But that belief becomes increasingly difficult to maintain as the conflict deepens. At the same time, domestic political pressures begin to intensify. In the United States, leaders must justify their actions not only to allies, but to a domestic audience that is watching closely. In Israel, the stakes are even more immediate, where security decisions are closely tied to political survival. And in Iran, leadership must balance external confrontation with internal stability, ensuring that the response to external pressure does not destabilize the system from within. So what you have is a convergence of pressures, strategic pressure, political pressure, psychological pressure, all operating at the same time, all reinforcing each other. And once that happens, restraint becomes harder to justify, because restraint in this context is not seen as neutrality. It is seen as a decision. And sometimes it is interpreted as weakness. This is one of the most important and often misunderstood aspects of escalation. It's not just about what you do. It's about what others believe your actions mean. And once a certain interpretation takes hold, it becomes very difficult to change. So by early April, the conflict has already crossed into a new phase, not total war, but something far more dangerous than the early tensions we saw in February, because now each side is operating with a clear understanding. The other side is willing to use force directly. And once that realization sets in, the strategic landscape shifts permanently. The question is no longer, can this be avoided? It becomes, how far will this go? And that's a very different question, because now every move carries the risk of escalation. Every decision has consequences that are no longer theoretical. And every delay is measured against the possibility that waiting may make the situation worse. This is the point where wars begin to take on a logic of their own, where decisions are no longer just about strategy, but about momentum. And once momentum builds, it becomes increasingly difficult to stop. If there's a lesson in this phase, it's that escalation is not always dramatic. It doesn't always come with a single defining moment. More often, it comes through a series of decisions that individually seem justified, but collectively change the nature of the conflict. And by the time you recognize that shift, the system has already moved beyond the point where simple solutions are possible. Because in geopolitics, as in life, the most dangerous turning points are not always the ones you see coming. They're the ones you only understand in hindsight. And the challenge then is learning to recognize them while they're still unfolding. Once the conflict moves into direct strikes, something very important happens. It stops being contained between the original actors and starts to expand outward. And that expansion is not random. It follows existing fault lines. In this case, those fault lines are Iran's regional networks, its long-standing alliances, and the broader architecture of influence it has spent years building. Because what we're really talking about here is not just a bilateral conflict anymore. We're talking about a system, a network of relationships that extends across multiple countries, each with its own internal dynamics, its own actors, and its own vulnerabilities. For Iran, this network is not an add-on to its strategy. It is the strategy. Through groups like Hezbollah and other aligned forces across the region, Iran has created a form of strategic depth. It's a way of projecting influence without relying on conventional military parity. It's about creating multiple pressure points so that any adversary has to think not just about Iran itself, but about the broader region. Now, from Iran's perspective, this is fundamentally defensive. It allows Tehran to deter attacks by increasing the potential cost of any military action. If you strike Iran, you're not just striking one country, you're potentially triggering responses from multiple fronts. But from the perspective of the United States and Israel, this network looks very different. It looks like expansion, it looks like encirclement, it looks like the gradual extension of Iranian influence into territories that are already fragile, already contested, and already vulnerable to instability. So when the direct conflict begins, these networks don't remain passive, they activate. And this is where things become significantly more complex, because now you're no longer dealing with 2 or 3 state actors making decisions at the national level. You're dealing with a web of state and non-state actors, each interpreting events through its own lens, each responding to local and regional pressures, and each capable of escalating the situation in its own way. This is what transforms a contained conflict into a regional one. We begin to see coordinated activity from Iranian-aligned groups across multiple theaters, rocket fire from southern Lebanon, drone activity in contested areas, increased pressure on shipping routes, targeted operations against military and infrastructure assets. These are not isolated incidents. They are part of a broader pattern of activation. And from the perspective of these groups, their actions are not separate from Iran's strategy. They are part of it. They are contributing to a shared objective, increasing pressure on adversaries, demonstrating resilience, and signaling that Iran's influence cannot be easily contained. But here's where the risk multiplies, because once these actors begin to move, control becomes much more diffuse. Iran may influence them, coordinate with them, or support them, but it does not fully control them. And that means decisions can be made locally that have global consequences. This is one of the defining characteristics of modern conflict, the decentralization of power. And decentralization creates unpredictability. For example, a strike in one location may trigger a response in another. A tactical decision made by a proxy group may provoke a reaction from Israel. That reaction may then be interpreted by Iran as escalation, leading to further action. And suddenly, what began as a localized exchange becomes a broader cycle of retaliation. This is how escalation spreads, not through a single decision, but through a chain of reactions. At the same time, the humanitarian and economic consequences begin to grow. Civilian populations are affected, infrastructure is damaged, supply chains are disrupted, and critically, global energy markets begin to react, because the Middle East is not just a political region, it's an economic one. Any disruption in key areas can have ripple effects across the global economy. Oil prices fluctuate, shipping routes become more uncertain, insurance costs rise, and suddenly countries far removed from the conflict begin to feel its impact. This is where the war becomes global in a different sense, not through direct involvement, but through systemic impact. And this matters because it changes how external actors respond. Countries outside the immediate conflict, whether in Europe, Asia, or elsewhere, are now forced to reassess their positions. Do they align more closely with the United States? Do they attempt to remain neutral? Do they engage diplomatically to try to de-escalate the situation? These are not simple choices. They involve trade-offs, economic, political, and strategic. And as the conflict continues, those trade-offs become more difficult to manage. Meanwhile, within the region itself, states that are not directly involved are still affected. They face increased pressure, both internally and externally. Some may feel compelled to take sides. Others may attempt to balance relationships. But in either case, neutrality becomes harder to maintain. And this is one of the most important dynamics to understand. In a conflict like this, neutrality is not always a stable position. It can be eroded over time by pressure, by proximity, and by the need to respond to changing circumstances. So what begins as a bilateral conflict gradually transforms into something much larger, a regional system under stress. And once that system is activated, it becomes much harder to predict outcomes, because now you're not just modeling the behavior of states, you're modeling the behavior of networks. And networks are inherently more complex. They have more variables, more actors, more pathways for escalation. And that means more opportunities for things to go wrong. If there's one lesson to take from this phase, it's this: modern conflicts don't stay contained because the world itself is no longer contained. Actions in one place can trigger reactions in another. Local decisions can have global consequences. And once a network like this is activated, it becomes very difficult to shut it down, because in the end, escalation doesn't just move vertically, it moves horizontally. And once it spreads, it rarely moves back. When a conflict like this reaches a certain level of intensity, it stops being just a regional crisis. It becomes a global stress test, not only of military capability, but of economic resilience, political alignment, and institutional credibility. And that's exactly what we begin to see as the war moves into its later phase, because the impact of this conflict is not confined to the battlefields. It radiates outward through markets, through alliances, through expectations, and in many ways, the global system starts to react even faster than the conflict itself evolves. One of the first and most immediate effects is economic. Energy markets in particular respond almost instantly to instability in the Middle East. The region plays a critical role in global oil supply, and any disruption, whether real or anticipated, introduces volatility. Prices rise. Futures markets react. Shipping costs increase. And uncertainty becomes a factor that traders, investors, and governments all have to account for. This matters because energy is not just a commodity. It's so a foundation. It underpins industrial activity, transportation, food production, virtually every part of the global economy. So when energy markets become unstable, the effects don't stay contained. They spread. At the same time, global supply chains begin to feel pressure. Trade routes that pass through strategically important waterways become riskier. Insurance costs go up. Shipping slows down. And companies begin to reassess their exposure in a world that has only recently recovered from earlier disruptions. This kind of shock doesn't just create inconvenience, it creates hesitation, and hesitation is dangerous in economics because when businesses hesitate, investment slows. When investment slows, growth declines. And when growth declines, political pressure increases. So what you begin to see is a feedback loop, not just in the conflict itself, but in the global response to it. Now, layer on top of that the diplomatic dimension, because every major power is now forced to respond in some way, not all of them directly, but all of them meaningfully. Allies of the United States are watching closely, trying to interpret what this conflict means for their own security commitments. Some may align more closely, reinforcing existing alliances. Others may begin to question whether those alliances provide sufficient protection in a more volatile world. Meanwhile, countries that have historically maintained relationships with both the United States and Iran are now under pressure to clarify their positions. Neutrality, which is often a strategic advantage, becomes harder to maintain when the stakes are this high, because neutrality in a conflict of this scale is not just about avoiding involvement, it's about managing perception. And perception in international politics is currency. So governments begin to make choices, some subtle, some explicit. Statements are issued, diplomatic channels are activated, quiet negotiations begin in the background, even as public rhetoric remains firm. And this is where the gap between public positioning and private diplomacy becomes critical. Publicly, states often adopt strong stances. They signal resolve. They reassure domestic audiences. They project strength. But privately, there is almost always an effort to find pathways toward de-escalation. Because while conflict may sometimes be unavoidable, prolonged instability is rarely in anyone's interest. However, here's the challenge. The longer the conflict continues, the harder it becomes to separate posturing from reality. Positions harden, trust diminishes, and the space for compromise shrinks. At the same time, internal pressures within countries begin to intensify. In Iran, the leadership faces the challenge of maintaining internal cohesion under external pressure. Economic strain, public sentiment, and political dynamics all play a role. In Israel, security concerns are deeply tied to national identity and political expectations, making restraint a difficult message to sustain. And in the United States, leaders must balance international strategy with domestic political considerations, where public opinion can shift quickly depending on how the conflict is perceived. So you have a situation where every major actor is dealing with both external and internal pressures simultaneously. And that combination makes decision-making far more complex than it might appear from the outside. But perhaps the most important global impact of this conflict is not economic or diplomatic, it's psychological. because this war challenges a fundamental assumption that underpins the modern international system, the idea that major powers can manage conflict without it escalating beyond control. That assumption is now under strain, and when that assumption is questioned, it creates uncertainty, not just about this conflict, but about future ones. It raises new questions. How far can escalation go? What are the limits? Can conflicts like this be contained, or are they inherently prone to expansion? These are not abstract questions. They influence how governments plan, how markets react, how alliances function, and ultimately how the global system evolves, because what we are witnessing is not just a conflict between a few countries. It is a moment that forces a reassessment of how the world works. And in moments like this, history tends to move in one of two directions. It either stabilizes through diplomacy, through recalibration, through a recognition that the costs of escalation are too high, or it continues to accelerate, driven by momentum, by miscalculation, and by the difficulty of stepping back once a certain threshold has been crossed. Right now, the system is in a state of tension between those two possibilities, and that tension is where the future is being decided. So the question is not just what happens next in this conflict. The question is how the world responds to it. Because in the end, this war is not just about the Middle East. It's about the rules, the assumptions, and the limits that define the global order itself. And those are not decided on the battlefield alone. They are decided in the choices we make in response to it. And the most important choice always is whether we allow events to control us or whether we still have the capacity to shape them.